The Industrial Revolution, that magical time in history when factories multiplied, safety standards didn't exist, and workers were treated like crash test dummies in a science experiment no one was monitoring. This is the story of 10 jobs that were so dangerous, so catastrophically mismanaged, that you'd be safer juggling knives during an earthquake. Get ready for glowing bones, lungs full of cotton dust, and entire jaws falling off. This is real history and it's disgusting. 1. The Radium Girls, America's glow-in-the-dark scandal in the 1910s and 20s. Radium was marketed as a miracle. It glowed. It cured. It was even sold in toothpaste. So of course it found its way into the booming watch industry. Enter the Radium Girls, young women, mostly teens, hired to paint watch dials with radioactive paint that glowed in the dark. The job came with a trick. The brushes had to be kept fine-pointed. The method? Lip pointing. They were told to put the tip of the brush in their mouth to get a perfect edge. Management told them it was perfectly safe. Some girls even painted their teeth and nails for fun. But radium doesn't leave the body, it settles in your bones. Within a few years, the women began developing mysterious symptoms. Toothaches turned into full-blown jaw necrosis. One woman's jawbone literally came out of her mouth. Others developed anemias, spontaneous bone fractures, and deadly tumors. The company denied everything, claimed it was syphilis, blamed the victims. But 5 of the girls, called the Radium 5, took them to court. It was the first time workers had successfully sued a major corporation for occupational illness, and their case led to major workplace safety reforms. They lost their lives, but they made history with bones that literally glowed in the dark. 2. Phossy jaw, the matchstick factory nightmare in the 19th century. Factories that made matches used white phosphorus, a chemical so volatile it could ignite spontaneously in air. Workers, mostly poor women and children, were around this stuff constantly, and because safety measures were basically non-existent, that phosphorus started doing something horrific. It ate away their faces. Phossy jaw was the result of chronic exposure. The phosphorus entered the mouth through inhalation or hand-to-mouth contact. The gums turned white, the teeth loosened, and then the jawbone itself began to die. In later stages, it would glow faintly in the dark, no joke, and rot right through the skin, giving off a horrible stench of decay. Workers complained of toothaches, swelling, and constant pain. Management ignored them. Some had to have their jaws surgically removed without anesthesia. This is the 1800s after all. Others simply died of the resulting infections or sepsis. It wasn't until workers organized and demanded safer conditions and later that red phosphorus was developed that anything changed. In some countries, the use of white phosphorus was banned decades before the companies actually stopped using it. By that time, hundreds, maybe thousands of people had suffered one of the most gruesome industrial fates in history. 3. Mad Hatter's disease, mercury, felt, and full-blown madness. The phrase mad as a hatter wasn't just colorful language, it was literal. From the 18th to early 20th centuries, hat makers were exposed daily to mercuric nitrate, used in turning fur into felt. Mercury vapors would fill the workshops, and the workers inhaled them for hours on end. Symptoms of mercury poisoning are downright terrifying. It starts with irritability and mood swings, then tremors, slurred speech, hallucinations, tooth loss, and dementia-like symptoms. Workers developed what they called the hatter's shakes, trembling hands so bad they couldn't even hold a teacup. Others suffered memory loss, paranoia, and psychosis. People just assumed hatters were eccentric, unaware that it was the toxic fumes slowly melting their brains. Mercury attacks the central nervous system. There was no protective gear, no ventilation, no awareness. You'd show up to work a sane man and leave twitching, shaking, and raving to yourself about the devil living in your hat block. Eventually, science caught up, but by then, the damage was done. Entire generations of craftspeople were quietly sacrificed for fashion. 4. Canary miners. When the bird dies, so might you deep underground. Miners faced more than cave-ins and collapsing tunnels. They faced an invisible killer, carbon monoxide, along with methane and other noxious gases. The canary in the coal mine wasn't a metaphor, it was a survival mechanism. Canaries are more sensitive to airborne toxins than humans. Miners would bring them into the tunnels in small cages. If the bird passed out or died, that was your signal to run fast. Sometimes you had minutes, sometimes seconds. But the truth is, even when the canaries gave their warning, the men still went back in every day because they had no choice. Long-term exposure led to chronic respiratory issues, asthma, emphysema, black lung. Many collapsed years before retirement, others never made it out at all, and while the birds gave them a shot at surviving gas leaks, no one protected them from the daily damage of breathing dust, soot, and poison. It was workplace roulette, every shift a gamble, every breath a potential death sentence, and nobody was keeping track. Of the body count, 5, bisonosis brown lung in the cotton mills. You'd think working with cotton would be clean and soft and vaguely pleasant, but in 19th and early 20th century textile mills, it was the opposite. These places were packed with airborne cotton dust, and ventilation was non-existent. Workers developed a disease called bisonosis or brown lung, the first symptoms. A tight chest and coughing often on Monday mornings after a weekend away. They called it Monday fever. But as exposure continued, lungs would scar over, breathing became labored, the cough became constant. Some couldn't climb stairs, others suffocated slowly, their lungs filled with fiber they could never expel. It disproportionately hit poor women and children. They were seen as disposable labor. No one offered masks, no one explained the risks, just rows and rows of whirring machines, dust clouds, and supervisors yelling over the din. It took decades before the medical community recognized bisonosis as a workplace illness, and even longer, before mills were forced to clean up the air. But by then, thousands were already broken. 6. Asbestos workers, the snow that kills you decades later. Asbestos was once hailed as a miracle material, fireproof, strong, and cheap. It was used in everything: insulation, ceilings, car brakes, even household items. But what no one realized at the time, or more likely, chose to ignore, was that breathing in asbestos fibers was like inhaling tiny shards of glass. At first, workers didn't notice much, maybe a cough, maybe a little chest tightness, but over time, those microscopic fibers lodged themselves deep in the lungs, causing asbestosis, a scarring of lung tissue that slowly suffocates you. Even worse, it also caused mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer that often doesn't show up until 40 years after exposure. Factories would fill with white, snowy clouds of asbestos dust. People made snowballs out of it. They brought it home on their clothes. Some workers' kids got sick just from hugging their parents after a shift. The companies knew. There were internal memos from as early as the 1930s showing they understood the risks, but they buried the evidence, kept the factories running, and let thousands die slow, wheezing deaths so they could keep the money flowing. Today, we're still seeing lawsuits and settlements for people who were poisoned decades ago. Asbestos is banned in many places now, but the damage was done. Entire towns, especially those built around asbestos mining or insulation plants, were wiped out, all because of something that looked like snow but killed like a knife. 7. The dancing plague of 1518. Occupational stress or moldy LSD? Let's rewind to the summer of 1518. Strasbourg in the Holy Roman Empire. A woman walks out into the street and begins dancing, not twirling, not partying, just dancing, uncontrollably, for hours, days. People gather, some join in, and then more. Within a week, it's dozens, then hundreds. They can't stop, no music, no festival, just twitching, spinning, collapsing. Some reportedly danced themselves to death, heart attacks, exhaustion, strokes. So what happened? One theory? Mass hysteria, stress, trauma, and starvation in the population caused a kind of psychosomatic chain reaction. Another, more disturbing idea, ergotism, that's poisoning from moldy rye grain, and the mold. Ergot, the same fungus used to synthesize LSD, so it's entirely possible that these people were unknowingly tripping balls, hallucinating and convulsing from a toxic loaf of bread. And here's the kicker, the authorities didn't stop them. They built a bigger dance floor. They brought in musicians. They thought the dancers were possessed and needed to dance the devil out. What they got instead were corpses. So was it a workplace issue? Maybe. Most victims were laborers, and after years of famine, plague, and overwork, their brains might have just snapped. Whether it was bad bread or bad times, it was one of the strangest health disasters in history. People danced themselves into the grave, and no one could explain why. 8 radium dial painters in the US are glowing lies behind the Iron Curtain after the Radium Girls scandal in the US. You'd think the rest of the world would slam the brakes on using radioactive paint, but in the Soviet Union, the dial painting business kept right on glowing. Soviet factories continued employing young women to paint clocks, military instruments, and aircraft dials with radium-based luminescent paint, and yes, they were still lip-pointing their brushes, just like their American counterparts had been warned never to do. The difference? In the USSR, everything was hush-hush. Workers weren't told the dangers. And when they got sick, their deaths were rarely acknowledged publicly. Medical care was minimal. Some women experienced tooth decay, jaw necrosis, and mysterious cancers. Others were hospitalized with symptoms identical to what had been seen in the West. But the Soviet government had a firm grip on information. There were no public trials, no lawsuits, no real compensation, just silence. The records that do exist suggest that radium factories operated in places like Moscow and Tashkent well into the 1950s and 60s. Some reports even claim workers glowed in the dark on their way home, but the stories were dismissed or buried under layers of bureaucracy and propaganda. So while American radium girls made headlines in history books, their Soviet counterparts were quietly erased, another tragic consequence of state secrecy and industrial negligence. 9. Toxic gas in Belgian chemical factories. Poison in every breath. In the early 1900s, Belgium was at the forefront of industrial chemistry. Chemical plants in places like Antwerp were producing everything from dyes to explosives. The problem? The people working in those factories were being slowly gassed to death. One of the biggest culprits was phosgene, a gas that smells like freshly cut hay, and was also used as a chemical weapon in World War I. It was just one of many toxic byproducts workers were exposed to daily. Others included chlorine, sulfur dioxide, and ammonia. Factories had no proper ventilation, no masks, no protective suits. Workers would complain of nausea, vomiting, chest pain, and coughing up blood. Some went blind, others collapsed mid-shift and were never seen again. The death toll was quietly absorbed into vague reports of workplace illness or pneumonia. In one factory, workers described a permanent yellow haze in the air. Their skin would peel, their lungs burned, and still they showed up every day because what else were they supposed to do? Quit and starve? Even after chemical weapons were outlawed in warfare, the same gases kept getting used in peacetime industry just without the battlefield. The workers were the soldiers now, and no one gave them a gas mask. 10. Silicosis, the dust that turns lungs to cement. Last but definitely not least, silicosis. This is the disease that haunted stonecutters, miners, sandblasters, anyone who worked with rock, especially quartz and granite. When those materials are cut or ground, they release crystalline silica dust into the air, and if you breathe that in over time, your lungs don't just get sick, they start to turn into rock. Silica dust is so fine, it bypasses your body's natural defenses. Once it gets deep into your lungs, your immune system tries to fight it off and fails. Scar tissue builds up, air sacs stiffen, you lose your ability to breathe, and there's no reversing it. Silicosis is progressive and fatal. Symptoms start subtly, a little shortness of breath, maybe a dry cough, but they escalate. Soon, you're gasping after climbing stairs, then walking, then just sitting. By the time it's diagnosed, the damage is usually permanent. One of the worst cases in U.S. history happened in the 1930s during the construction of the Hawks Nest Tunnel in West Virginia. Workers were exposed to massive amounts of silica without any protection. Over 700 men died. Some say the real toll was over 1,000. It took lawsuits, protests, and decades of scientific evidence to get serious regulations passed. Today, we know how to prevent it, but in the past, a dusty job site was a slow-motion execution. These weren't freak accidents or rare misfortunes. These were predictable, preventable, and systemic failures. Human lives were treated as disposable, all in the name of profit, progress, and glowing products. Each of these stories left behind a legacy not just of tragedy but of reform. Modern workplace safety exists because these people suffered, fought, and in many cases died to make it happen. So the next time you put on a hard hat or see a danger sign at work, remember, someone had to get hurt for that warning to exist. Stay safe and don't lick your paintbrush.